Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we are going somewhere extremely hot. Not metaphorically hot. Not, oh it is a bit warm today, hot. Not, I should probably put on some sunscreen hot. We are talking about a level of heat that a modern person, accustomed to air conditioning and insulated buildings, and the general infrastructure of climate-controlled existence would find not just uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous within hours of exposure. We are going to ancient Egypt, and specifically, we are going to talk about the single most impressive thing the ancient Egyptians did. More impressive, arguably, than building the pyramids. More impressive than inventing writing. More impressive than producing 3,000 years of continuous civilization. We are going to talk about the fact that they did all of those things in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, in a desert, without air conditioning, without refrigeration, without synthetic moisture-wicking fabrics, without SPF 50 sunscreen, without electrolyte drinks, without any of the technology that modern humans use to manage the simple, physical problem of being too hot. They not only survived this, they thrived in it. They built cities, they farmed, they constructed monuments, they developed medicine and art and literature and bureaucracy. They did all of the things that civilization does, and they did them in conditions that would hospitalize a modern office worker who complains when the break room AC is set to 71 instead of 70. Tonight, we are going to see how they pulled this off. Tonight, we are going to find out exactly how they pulled this off. We are going to go through every strategy, every technique, every piece of engineering and biology and cultural practice that the ancient Egyptians developed specifically to manage the problem of living in one of the hottest inhabited environments on Earth. And along the way, we are going to discover that some of their solutions were so smart that modern engineers, architects and scientists are only now catching up to what they figured out 4,000 years ago without any of the tools we take for granted. We are also going to be completely honest about the ways in which even the Egyptians, with all their accumulated expertise, did not fully solve the problem, because the heat killed people in ancient Egypt regularly, and the records they left behind tell us exactly who was most at risk, what happened when things went wrong, and what the limits of their remarkable ingenuity actually were. So before we begin, if you are new here, welcome. Like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what time it is and where in the world you are watching from. I genuinely love knowing where this community stretches. Now, it is approximately 1300 BCE. It is July. It is 10 in the morning, and it is already 95 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. The sun is the dominant feature of the sky in a way that Northern European or North American people do not fully experience. Not just bright, but physically present, a force that pushes down on everything beneath it with palpable weight. And you are a person who has to get through this day alive. Let us talk about how. Before we can appreciate how the Egyptians managed the heat, we need to be precise about what the heat was doing to them and what it would do to you, because heat is not just uncomfortable. At the levels experienced in the Egyptian summer, it is actively and specifically lethal in ways that have nothing to do with dramatic Hollywood desert scenes, and everything to do with the specific biology of the human body under thermal stress. The human body is a heat-generating machine. Every metabolic process your body runs, digestion, muscle movement, organ function, the electrical activity of your brain, produces heat as a byproduct. Under normal conditions, this heat is managed through a combination of radiation, convection, and the evaporation of sweat. Your skin radiates heat into the surrounding air. Air movement carries heat away from the skin's surface. Sweat evaporates and carries heat away with it. The system works beautifully when the surrounding air is cooler than your body temperature and dry enough to allow evaporation. When the surrounding air is hotter than your body temperature, which in the Egyptian summer is a routine daily occurrence, the first two mechanisms stop working. You cannot radiate heat into air that is hotter than you are. You cannot convect heat away through air that is already at or above body temperature. You are left entirely dependent on evaporative cooling, sweating, as your only mechanism for managing body temperature. This works, but it has a cost. Sweat is water, and water in an environment of extreme heat and dry air evaporates with extraordinary speed. A person engaged in moderate physical activity in a 100-degree desert environment can lose between 1 and 2 liters of sweat per hour. This water has to be replaced continuously, or the consequences arrive quickly. Mild dehydration, a loss of 1 to 2% of body weight in fluid, produces headache, reduced concentration, and impaired physical performance. Moderate dehydration produces dizziness, muscle cramps, and significant cognitive impairment. Severe dehydration, beyond about 8% body weight loss in fluid, produces confusion, organ stress, and without intervention, death. In a desert environment without immediate access to water, a person can progress from healthy to severely dehydrated in a matter of hours. In the Egyptian summer heat, an unprotected person without water access could be in serious danger within 2 to 3 hours. The Egyptian records of workers collapsing in the heat, the Egyptian medical texts' treatments for heat-related illness, the careful logistical arrangements around water supply at construction sites. All of these reflect a culture that had learned through experience exactly how quickly and how seriously the heat could become dangerous. The second major heat-related threat is hypothermia, the condition in which the body's core temperature rises to dangerous levels. Normal human core temperature is approximately 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. At 103 degrees, physiological function begins to be significantly impaired. At 107 degrees, you're in a medical emergency. At 109 degrees, cellular damage becomes irreversible. The human body's cooling systems are working against a challenging thermodynamic problem in a 100-degree environment, and if those systems are overwhelmed through dehydration, through excessive physical exertion, through inadequate shade, hypothermia follows with speed that leaves very little margin for error. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke are the clinical names for the progression of this process. Heat exhaustion, the earlier stage, produces weakness, nausea, dizziness, heavy sweating, and a rapid pulse. The person is still sweating, still cooling, but struggling to maintain equilibrium. Heat stroke, the more severe stage, can involve cessation of sweating as the cooling system itself fails. Confusion, disorientation, seizures, and without immediate intervention, death. Ancient Egyptian medical texts contain descriptions of conditions that correspond to heat-related illness. The treatments prescribed, rest in shade, provision of cool water, the application of cooling substances to the head and body, are essentially the same first aid interventions modern medicine recommends for heat exhaustion. The Egyptians may not have had the physiological vocabulary, but they had the observation. They knew what happened when someone got too hot. They had seen it enough times to develop standardized responses. The salt component of this problem is worth noting because it is one that is not always obvious. Sweat is not pure water. It contains electrolytes, primarily sodium and chloride, with smaller amounts of potassium and other minerals. As a person sweats heavily over sustained periods, they're losing not just water, but the electrolytes that the body needs for muscle function, nerve conduction, and fluid balance. Replacing water without replacing electrolytes can actually worsen the condition, a phenomenon called hyponatremia, or low blood sodium, which produces its own set of dangerous symptoms. The Egyptians did not understand electrolyte physiology, but they did use salt in their diet extensively, and the specific foods and beverages they consumed during heat exposure, heavily salted preparations, fermented beverages that contained mineral content from their production process, would have provided some electrolyte replacement alongside fluid replacement, even without any conscious understanding of why this helped. Their dietary habits had been shaped by thousands of years of living in a sodium-depleting environment, and the result was a food culture that incidentally addressed one of the key physiological challenges of that environment. If you are going to dress for a 100-degree desert environment, the Egyptians had essentially figured out the optimal approach 4,000 years before anyone had a scientific explanation for why it worked. And the solution was linen, specifically white linen, worn in specific ways that managed the competing demands of sun protection, heat dissipation, and modesty in ways that are genuinely impressive from an engineering perspective. Linen is made from the fibers of the flax plant, which grew extensively in Egypt along the Nile. Egyptian linen production was a major industry. The flax was grown, harvested, retted in water to soften the fibers, dried, beaten, combed, spun into thread, and woven into fabric. The quality of Egyptian linen varied across an enormous range, from the extremely coarse to the extraordinarily fine, and different qualities were used for different purposes. The finest Egyptian linen, the royal linen reserved for pharaohs, the highest elite, was woven so finely that it was essentially transparent. Yes, the pharaohs and high priests of Egypt were essentially walking around in $1,000 ultra-premium see-through linen. It wasn't an exhibitionist fashion statement, it was structural survival. For heat management, linen has several properties that make it superior to other natural fabrics in hot, dry conditions. It is highly moisture absorbent. It can absorb up to 20% of its own weight in moisture before feeling damp, which means it absorbs sweat efficiently and holds it away from the skin surface while it evaporates. It is a good conductor of heat relative to other natural fibers, meaning it does not trap body heat against the skin. It dries quickly, which means the evaporative cooling process it facilitates is continuous rather than intermittent. It is durable, washable, and becomes softer with repeated washing, an important practical quality in a culture that laundered clothing regularly. The colour white was not an arbitrary fashion choice. White fabric reflects a significant portion of the solar radiation that hits it, rather than absorbing it. Dark fabric absorbs solar radiation and converts it to heat, which is then transferred to the body wearing it. In an environment where the radiant heat from direct sunlight is a major component of total heat load, wearing white rather than dark fabric makes a measurable difference to how much solar energy a person absorbs. The Egyptians did not have the physics to explain this, but they had the empirical observation that white clothing was cooler to wear in direct sun than darker fabrics, and they built their clothing culture accordingly. The specific style of Egyptian linen garments also contributed to their thermal effectiveness. The basic male garment, the shendi or linen kilt, was a length of fabric wrapped around the lower body and secured at the waist, leaving the upper body bare or covered with a simple linen drape. This arrangement allowed maximum skin exposure for evaporative cooling while providing coverage that reduced direct solar radiation on the most thermally vulnerable areas. The garment moved freely with the body, allowing air circulation between fabric and skin. It could be adjusted for more or less coverage depending on the level of sun exposure. Women's garments typically covered more of the body, but were made from the finest available linen, thin enough to allow air circulation and evaporative cooling through the fabric. The typical depiction of Egyptian women's clothing in tomb paintings shows close-fitting white linen dresses that, while modest in coverage, were light enough to allow the heat management functions of the fabric to work. What Egyptians did not do, and what modern tourists to Egypt still frequently get wrong, is wear the heavy, insulating, covering layers that intuition suggests might protect against heat. The impulse to cover everything to avoid sun contact has a logic to it, but in a genuinely hot environment, the insulating effect of heavy covering produces more heat retention than the sun protection provides benefit. The Egyptian solution, light, white, loose, breathable linen that protected against direct solar radiation while facilitating evaporative cooling, is the solution that modern fabric technology has been trying to replicate, and which performance athletic wear attempts to approximate. The production of linen was itself a major feature of Egyptian daily life and economy. Weaving was primarily women's work in ancient Egypt. Professional weavers worked in institutional workshops attached to temples and estates, but domestic textile production was also extensive and expected of women across the social spectrum. The linen that managed Egypt's heat was produced by a female workforce whose contribution to the civilization's survival in its thermal environment was as important as any architectural or engineering achievement. The most impressive Egyptian response to the heat challenge was not clothing or diet or any personal strategy. It was architecture, the design of living and working spaces specifically engineered to manage heat in an era when engineering and building were done entirely by hand, without computer modelling, without modern materials science, and without anything except the accumulated practical knowledge of a civilization that had been solving this problem for thousands of years. Egyptian domestic architecture was a heat management system first and a shelter second. Every major design decision, the orientation of the building, the thickness of the walls, the placement of windows, the height of the ceiling, the materials used in construction, was driven by the need to keep the interior as much cooler than the exterior as possible. The primary building material was mud brick, blocks made from Nile silt mixed with chopped straw and water, pressed into wooden moulds and dried in the sun. Mud brick is an extraordinary thermal material. Its high thermal mass means that it absorbs heat slowly during the day and releases it slowly at night, creating a significant lag between the peak external temperature and the heat that reaches the interior of the building. A mud brick wall a foot or more thick, exposed to 100-degree heat on its outer surface, will not transmit that heat to the interior for many hours, long enough that by the time the wall is releasing the day's heat inward, the nighttime drop in temperature has begun to cool the exterior again. This is called thermal lag, and it is a fundamental principle of passive building design. Modern architects working on energy-efficient buildings in hot climates use computer models to optimize wall thickness and thermal mass for maximum thermal lag. Egyptian builders arrived at the same result through thousands of years of empirical refinement without any of the theory. The walls they built were thick because thick walls were cooler inside. They knew this because they had lived in thick-walled buildings and thin-walled buildings, and the difference was measurable and significant. The orientation of Egyptian houses was also deliberate. The prevailing wind in Egypt comes from the north. The Mediterranean breeze that moves up the Nile Valley provides the only significant natural cooling available in the Egyptian climate. Egyptian buildings were oriented to catch this north wind, with the primary ventilation openings facing north to maximize the benefit of the breeze. The wind catcher, a structure built above the roofline specifically to catch and direct prevailing wind into the interior of the building, appears in Egyptian architecture from the earliest periods and is one of the most elegant passive cooling technologies ever developed. The wind catcher, called a malkaf in Arabic, is a tower-like structure with one face open to the prevailing wind and the interior designed to direct the captured air downward into the building. As the air moves down through the tower, it passes through the mass of the tower structure, which is cooler than the exterior air and loses some of its heat before entering the living space. In its most sophisticated form, the air passed over water or damp materials in the tower base, losing additional heat to evaporative cooling before entering the rooms below. The result, in a building with a well-designed wind catcher and adequate thermal mass in its walls and roof, could be an interior temperature 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than the outside air temperature. In a 100-degree exterior environment, an interior of 80 to 85 degrees is dramatically more comfortable and dramatically safer in terms of heat stress on the occupants. The same principle of wind capture and cooling is used in traditional architecture across the Middle East and North Africa, and is being actively studied by modern architects as a zero-energy cooling technology for hot climate buildings. The flat roof of the Egyptian house was not just structural, it was functional living space, used extensively during the hottest parts of the year. At night, when the exterior temperature dropped significantly from the daytime peak, the Egyptian desert night can be 30 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than the afternoon peak. The roof was where people slept. The nighttime sky is an excellent radiative cooler, A person lying on a flat roof on a clear night radiates heat to the sky effectively and can sleep comfortably at temperatures that would be difficult inside a building that is still releasing the day's absorbed heat. Sleeping on the roof was not a poor person's compromise in ancient Egypt. It was the thermally correct choice. The wealthy and the ordinary alike spent summer nights on their rooftops. The administrative records from Deir el-Medina, the workers' village that provided much of our knowledge of ordinary Egyptian domestic life, include references to roof sleeping during the hot months as standard practice. The Egyptian summer night sky, clear and brilliant and cooling rapidly after sunset, was the ceiling of the bedroom for most of the population for most of the year. The interior arrangement of Egyptian houses also served heat management. Rooms used during the hottest parts of the day were positioned in the coolest part of the building, typically the lower level and the northern side, shaded from the high sun and benefiting most from the north wind. Higher rooms and southern exposures were used for storage or avoided during peak heat. The movement of the household through the building across the day followed the movement of shade and cool air. Water features appeared in the gardens and courtyards of wealthier Egyptian homes, providing evaporative cooling to the immediate environment. A pool or channel of water in a courtyard, combined with plantings that shaded the water and surrounding ground, could lower the temperature of the courtyard significantly through evaporative and radiative cooling. The Egyptian garden was not purely aesthetic, it was a heat management installation. Water in ancient Egypt was everything. This is not a metaphor. In a desert environment where the sun was relentless, where physical activity produced constant sweat loss, where the alternative to adequate hydration was a progression toward heat exhaustion and death, water was the single most important resource in daily life. The entire civilization was organized around its primary water source, the Nile, and the management of water for drinking, for agriculture, for construction, and for cooling was the central logistical challenge of Egyptian life. The Nile itself was both the solution and the problem. It provided the water that made Egyptian civilization possible. It also provided the crocodiles, the parasites, the bacteria, and the various biological hazards that made drinking Nile water directly a somewhat adventurous choice. The Egyptians managed this tension through a combination of practices that addressed the practical water safety problem without any understanding of the germ theory that explains why some of their practices worked. Filtering was the first line of water management. Water collected from the Nile was passed through beds of sand and gravel that removed the suspended particles, the silt, the debris, the biological material, and produced water that was clearer and somewhat safer than the raw Nile water. Sand filtration does not remove dissolved chemical contaminants or all biological pathogens, but it removes a significant proportion of the suspended material that carries disease. Egyptian settlements had water filtration systems built into their storage infrastructure, large clay vessels with sand and gravel layers through which water was strained before storage. Ceramic storage vessels were the primary water storage technology, and their properties were well understood by Egyptian potters and users. Unglazed ceramic is slightly porous. Water slowly seeps through the vessel walls and evaporates on the outer surface, cooling the contents through the evaporative process. An unglazed ceramic water vessel stored in shade and exposed to dry air, can maintain its contents at temperatures noticeably cooler than the surrounding air. The Egyptians had been using ceramic vessels for water storage for thousands of years and had optimized vessel design for this cooling function without any understanding of the physics involved. The placement of water storage was deliberate. Water vessels were stored in the shadiest, most ventilated parts of the building, typically in a room or alcove that caught the north wind, maximizing the evaporative cooling on the vessel surface and maintaining the coolest possible interior temperature. The placement of a water jar in a north-facing location with good airflow was a specific and known technique for keeping water cool, not an accidental benefit. At construction sites and other locations where large numbers of workers needed water in a hot environment, water supply logistics were a serious organizational concern. The administrative records of pyramid construction sites show water carriers as a specific occupational category, people whose job was specifically to supply water to workers engaged in heavy labor. The ration documents from these sites specify water allocations alongside food rations, treating water supply as a managed resource whose distribution required the same administrative attention as food. The workers building in the summer heat were not expected to simply manage their own water needs. The organizational system recognized that workers engaged in heavy physical labor in extreme heat needed active water supply management, that allowing workers to become dehydrated would slow work and cause collapses that the project could not afford. The pyramid builders' water logistics were, in modern terms, occupational health management, 3,000 years before the concept existed. Beer served a significant hydration role alongside its social and nutritional functions. Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, slightly alcoholic, and crucially, produced through a fermentation process that made it substantially safer than raw water. The fermentation acidified the liquid and produced alcohol, both of which inhibited the growth of the waterborne pathogens that made raw Nile water risky. Beer was included in workers' rations explicitly and consumed in significant quantities throughout the working day. The alcohol content of Egyptian beer was lower than most modern beers, closer to a thick fermented porridge sitting at about 2%. This meant that everyone, from the stonecutters at Giza to literally toddlers, drank beer all day long as their primary fluid source. If you couldn't drink the river water, you gave your child a bowl of beer porridge to stay hydrated. Let that sit with you as you drift off tonight. Specific cooling drinks and preparations were made during periods of extreme heat. Preparations involving water infused with specific plants, some of which had properties that would be recognized today as electrolyte-containing or mild cooling agents, were consumed specifically for heat management. Preparations involving fruit juices, which provided both hydration and sugars, were used by those who could afford them. The specific cooling drinks of wealthy Egyptians, infused with herbs and spices and stored in the best cooled vessels, represented the premium tier of a heat management system that operated at every economic level. We discussed Egyptian oil and fat application as a beauty and hygiene practice in an earlier chapter of this series, but in the context of heat survival, it deserves a much more detailed examination because the daily anointing of the skin that Egyptians practiced was not primarily cosmetic. It was a physiologically intelligent response to the specific challenges that extreme heat pose to the human skin. In a dry desert environment with intense solar radiation, unprotected skin faces several simultaneous threats. Direct solar radiation damages the skin through ultraviolet exposure. Sunburn is the acute form of this damage, and increased skin cancer risk is the chronic consequence. The dry air draws moisture directly from the skin's surface through a process called transepidermal water loss. Moisture evaporates through the skin even without visible sweating, and in an extremely dry environment, this loss is significant enough to contribute to dehydration and to damage the skin's barrier function. The barrier function of the skin, its ability to prevent moisture loss and prevent environmental pathogens from entering the body, is compromised by excessive dryness, cracking, and sun damage. Oil applied to the skin surface addresses several of these problems simultaneously. A coating of oil on the skin reduces transepidermal water loss by creating a barrier that slows evaporative moisture loss from the skin's surface. It provides a limited degree of protection against direct solar radiation, not the comprehensive UV protection of modern sunscreen, but genuine reduction in the amount of solar energy reaching the skin cells. It prevents the cracking and scaling that accompany extreme skin dryness and that compromise the skin's barrier function. And it maintains the skin's flexibility and integrity in conditions that would otherwise accelerate its degradation. The Egyptians anointed their skin with oil or fat every morning as a standard practice across all social classes. The quality of the oil varied enormously. Wealthy Egyptians used expensive perfumed oils imported from across the ancient world, while ordinary Egyptians used cheaper preparations of castor oil, linseed oil, or literally rendered goose and ox fat. Imagine the smell of a hot, crowded marketplace in 1300 BCE, hundreds of people baking in 100-degree heat, entirely coated from head to toe in rancid protective animal fat. It sounds like a modern nightmare, but chemically, it was a flawless shield. Castor oil was among the most widely used skin preparations in ancient Egypt, and it is worth examining specifically because it is one of those cases where the ancient practice turns out to have genuine scientific support. Castor oil is a triglyceride rich in ricinoleic acid, a fatty acid with documented anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties. Applied to sun-stressed skin, castor oil provides genuine barrier protection, some anti-inflammatory effect on damaged skin cells, and antimicrobial protection for skin that has been compromised by cracking or abrasion. The ancient Egyptians chose castor oil for skin protection through empirical observation of its effects. Modern cosmetic chemists include castor oil in skin preparations for the same reasons. Now with the biochemical explanation to go with the observation, the specific preparation of the oil was also considered. Oils were frequently combined with aromatic plant materials, resins, herbs, spices, both for the pleasant fragrance and because some of these additions had genuine additional protective properties. Myrrh, a resin that was used extensively in Egyptian preparations, has documented antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. Frankincense, similarly used, has similar properties. The Egyptian habit of adding aromatic materials to skin preparations was simultaneously aesthetic. The preparation smelled good and potentially functional. Adding the bioactive compounds of these plants to the base protective function of the oil. The head was given specific protective attention beyond the standard body oiling. The scalp, being the most elevated surface of the body and therefore the most directly exposed to solar radiation, was particularly vulnerable to sun damage and to the thermal effects of direct sun exposure. The Egyptians' practice of shaving the head, which we will discuss in detail in a dedicated chapter, eliminated the hair that could otherwise trap heat against the scalp, but the shaved scalp then required specific protection against direct sun. Special preparations were applied to the shaved scalp, more heavily and more specifically than the general body oil. Some of these preparations were based on plant materials with known sun protective properties. Certain plant oils have documented UV-absorbing compounds. Others were animal fat preparations chosen for their thermal properties. The priests and workers who spent time outdoors with shaved heads were applying what was, functionally, an ancient form of sunscreen to the most vulnerable surface of their anatomy. The eyes received specific protective treatment beyond the kohl liner discussed elsewhere. The area around the eyes, the thin skin of the eyelids, and the surrounding face was particularly vulnerable to solar radiation damage and to the specific type of heat-related tissue damage that comes from sustained exposure to bright reflected light. Preparations applied around the eye area, including the kohl and additional unguent preparations, provided a layer of protection that reduced both the immediate discomfort of bright light exposure and the long-term damage from sustained UV exposure. In a previous chapter of this series, we discussed head shaving in the context of Egyptian beauty and hygiene culture, but the shaved head deserves its own chapter in the context of heat management, because it represents one of the most elegant and physiologically sound responses to the problem of heat management that any culture has developed. And understanding why it worked explains why it was universal among specific populations whose heat exposure was most intense. Hair is an insulator. This is its primary thermal function in mammals. It traps a layer of air next to the skin, and that trapped air layer slows the exchange of heat between the body and the environment. In cold environments, this insulation is valuable. It reduces heat loss from the body surface and helps maintain core temperature. This is why mammals in cold climates tend to have thick, dense fur coats. In a hot environment, this insulation function works in exactly the wrong direction. A layer of trapped air between the scalp and the environment is a layer that slows the dissipation of heat from the scalp. In a 100-degree environment where the goal is to get heat out of the body rather than to retain it, hair on the head is actively counterproductive from a thermal management perspective. It prevents the cooling breeze from reaching the scalp directly. It reduces the evaporative cooling efficiency of scalp sweating, and in direct sun, it absorbs solar radiation and converts it to heat that is then trapped against the scalp by the insulating function of the hair itself. A shaved scalp, by contrast, allows direct evaporative cooling from the scalp surface. Scalp sweating, which is significant, the head and scalp are major contributors to overall body cooling because of the high density of blood vessels near the surface, works at maximum efficiency on a bare scalp. The breeze reaches the skin directly. Cooling is maximized. The Egyptian solution was therefore thermally correct. in an environment where the head was one of the primary surfaces through which heat could be lost, removing the insulating barrier of hair and replacing it with a protective coating of oil on the bare skin produced maximum cooling efficiency while protecting the exposed scalp from solar damage. The shaved head covered with oil is, from a thermal engineering perspective, the optimal configuration for a human head in a hot desert environment. This understanding was apparently well enough established in Egyptian culture that it became institutionalized among the populations with the most intense heat exposure. The priests who conducted outdoor rituals in the full Egyptian sun, the soldiers who fought in desert conditions, the construction workers who spent full days in direct sun. These groups practiced head shaving most consistently and most completely. The correlation between intense heat exposure and head shaving in Egyptian cultural practice reflects a pragmatic response to a physiological reality. The wig culture that coexisted with the shaved head tradition was not contradictory to this logic. Wigs were worn for specific social and religious contexts, formal occasions, ritual performances, situations where appearance conventions required elaborate hair. They were removed in private and in conditions where heat management was more important than formal appearance. The wealthy Egyptian who wore an elaborate wig to a formal banquet and then removed it to sleep on the roof in the summer night was not being inconsistent. They were managing their appearance for the social context and managing their thermal environment for the physical one. The children's side lock, the specific hairstyle depicted in countless Egyptian paintings and reliefs in which children were shown with shaved heads except for a single lock of hair on one side of the skull, represented a compromise between the practical benefits of the shaved head and the social and ritual significance of hair as a marker of status and transition. The side lock was retained until puberty, at which point it was cut as part of the transition to adulthood ritual. During childhood, when heat exposure was both inevitable and particularly dangerous, children have less efficient heat regulation than adults and are more vulnerable to hypothermia. The effectively shaved head provided maximum thermal benefit. In a hot environment, the body's management of its own heat production becomes as important as its management of external heat input. Everything you eat requires metabolic processing, and metabolic processing produces heat. The composition of the diet therefore affects the body's internal heat load. Different foods produce different amounts of metabolic heat during digestion, and eating the wrong things in the wrong quantities in a hot environment actively makes the heat problem worse. The Egyptians' diet, shaped by thousands of years of living in their specific environment, had evolved in ways that addressed this metabolic heat problem, even without any theoretical understanding of it. The specific foods that dominated the Egyptian diet were, with few exceptions, foods that produced relatively low metabolic heat loads compared to the caloric value they provided, that maintained hydration, and that provided the electrolytes being lost through heavy sweating. The primary staple, bread made from emmer wheat or barley, provided complex carbohydrates, whose digestion produces less metabolic heat than the digestion of protein or fat. This is because the thermic effect of food, the metabolic heat generated in processing different macronutrients, varies significantly between carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Carbohydrates have the lowest thermic effect, protein the highest. A diet based primarily on grain was therefore a diet that minimized the internal heat load from digestion, which is thermally advantageous in a hot climate. The specific vegetables that featured prominently in the Egyptian diet, onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, cucumber, were almost all high in water content. Cucumber is approximately 95% water. Lettuce is similar. Consuming high water content vegetables provides hydration alongside nutrition, which in a sweat-depleting environment is a significant practical benefit. The Egyptian diet naturally incorporated what modern sports nutritionists would call hydrating foods as a major dietary component. The garlic and onion consumption that was notable enough for Herodotus to record the quantities consumed by pyramid workers served a purpose beyond flavor. Both plants have documented properties that assist in heat tolerance. Garlic sulfur compounds help maintain cardiovascular function under thermal stress, and the specific combination of minerals in these plants contributes to electrolyte replacement. The Egyptians' near-universal consumption of alliums was empirically derived dietary practice that happened to be physiologically appropriate for their environment. The timing of eating was also deliberate. The main meal of the day was taken in the middle of the day, at the time when the metabolic heat of digestion would coincide with the afternoon temperature peak. This might seem counterintuitive, but the reasoning is practical. Eating produces metabolic heat. In a warm environment, you want that metabolic heat to dissipate rather than to build up in the body. A substantial midday meal was followed immediately by a rest period, the siesta, during which the body was at low activity in the coolest available space, allowing the metabolic heat from digestion to dissipate without adding to it through physical activity. Eating a large meal in the evening in a hot climate, by contrast, produces metabolic heat at a time when the sleeping body has limited cooling capacity and cannot engage in the physical activity that might help dissipate that heat. The Egyptian pattern of heavy midday eating followed by rest, with a lighter evening meal, is thermally more sensible than the opposite pattern that many modern cultures follow, and its thermal logic may be one reason why siesta cultures persist in hot climates worldwide. The specific prohibition in some periods and contexts against eating certain heating foods in the hottest months reflects an Egyptian awareness of the dietary component of heat management. Strong spices, particularly those associated with heating effects in the body, pepper equivalents, various pungent preparations were consumed more moderately in summer than in winter. The Egyptian concept of cooling and heating foods, while articulated in terms that were cultural and magical rather than physiological, reflected genuine empirical observation of how different foods affected how the body felt and performed in hot conditions. We cannot discuss Egyptian heat survival without giving the midday rest its proper credit, because the siesta was not a cultural quirk or a sign of Egyptian laziness. It was a physiologically informed survival strategy that prevented heat deaths, maintained worker productivity, and organized the Egyptian day around the fundamental reality of the desert climate's temperature cycle. The temperature in the Egyptian summer follows a predictable daily curve. The night is relatively cool, a genuinely significant drop from the daytime peak, which can be 30 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit in the desert environment. As the sun rises, temperature climbs steadily through the morning. The peak temperature arrives somewhere between noon and 3 in the afternoon, when the sun's angle maximizes both direct radiation and accumulated surface heating. After the peak, temperature drops gradually through the afternoon and evening to the nighttime minimum. The Egyptian day was organized around this temperature curve with elegant rationality. Work began early, at first light, when temperatures were near their overnight minimum and physical labor was manageable. The morning hours from approximately sunrise to mid-morning were the primary work period. As temperatures climbed through the late morning and approached the midday peak, activity was reduced. At the peak of the day's heat, in the early to mid-afternoon, essentially all outdoor physical activity stopped. This was not simply a rest break. It was a heat avoidance strategy with physiological basis. During the peak heat hours, the risk of heat exhaustion from physical labor was highest. The metabolic heat produced by physical work combined with the external heat load of the hottest part of the day created thermal stress that could overwhelm the body's cooling capacity relatively quickly in susceptible individuals. Removing the metabolic heat component by ceasing physical activity during the hottest hours significantly reduced this risk. Workers rested in the shade, in their homes, in purpose-built shade structures, at construction sites, in the shadows of whatever large structures were available. They ate their midday meal. They slept if possible. The administrative records of Deir el-Medina show that the workday was organized around this midday break in ways that were formalized and respected. The break was not a casual arrangement, but a scheduled part of the working day. After the midday rest, as temperatures began to drop from the afternoon peak, work resumed for a second period that continued into the evening and sometimes after dark. The Egyptian workday was therefore split into 2 periods of activity separated by a midday rest, with the day's work distributed across the cooler parts of the day and the dangerous peak hours used for rest and recovery. The total hours of work were not necessarily shorter than a modern working day, but they were distributed more intelligently relative to the thermal environment. Modern research on human productivity in hot climates has confirmed what the Egyptians figured out empirically. Cognitive performance, physical performance, and accident rates all deteriorate significantly at high temperatures. A worker performing heavy physical labor at 100 degrees Fahrenheit is operating at reduced efficiency and increased risk of error and injury compared to the same worker at 70 degrees. Distributing the most demanding work to the cooler hours and removing activity during peak heat is the rational response to this reality, and the Egyptian daily schedule was built on exactly this logic. The siesta culture that persists across the Mediterranean world and North Africa in the present day is the direct cultural descendant of this survival strategy. The afternoon siesta of southern Spain, Italy, Greece and North Africa is not a charming cultural habit without practical basis. It is the preservation of a physiologically sound practice developed in hot climate civilizations that learned from experience when the day was safe to work in and when it was not. Understanding Egyptian heat management requires understanding that Egypt had 2 active periods each day rather than 1. The night, which modern people in temperature-controlled environments often think of as simply the time when work has ended and sleep begins, was in ancient Egypt a second period of activity, socialization, and life that was in some ways more comfortable and more vivid than the heat-constrained day. After sunset, the temperature in the Egyptian desert dropped with a speed and significance that is genuinely dramatic. The desert has low humidity, and low humidity air loses heat rapidly through radiative cooling when solar input ceases. The same dry air that allowed the brutal daytime heating to proceed without the moderating effect of moisture will cool to temperatures that feel almost cold by sunset standards within a few hours of dark. A 100-degree afternoon can become a 60-degree midnight in the Egyptian desert, a 40-degree drop that transforms the experience of being outdoors entirely. This nighttime cooling was not merely comfortable, it was the primary opportunity for the recovery from daytime heat stress that made it possible to survive and function through the next day. The body's temperature regulation, stress during the hot day, recovered during the cool night. The skin repaired itself. The hydration lost during daytime sweating could be replaced with relatively cool water. Sleep in cool nighttime air was genuinely restorative in a way that sleep during the hot midday hours was not. Egyptian social life was substantially organized around the nighttime hours during the summer months. Evening meals, social gatherings, outdoor activities, all of these moved to the cooler parts of the day. The markets that supplied the city's daily needs were active in the early morning and the evening, bracketing the dangerous midday heat. Religious ceremonies that required outdoor gatherings were scheduled for the hours of comfortable temperature. The night sky, brilliant, clear, and cooling, was the social environment of the Egyptian summer. The stars were not just a backdrop to this nighttime life. They were a navigational and theological resource that Egyptian culture engaged with in extraordinary depth. Egyptian astronomical knowledge was developed specifically in the context of a culture that spent significant time outdoors at night during the summer months, and the star catalogues, astronomical texts, and alignment techniques that Egyptian civilization developed reflect a level of sky observation that comes from genuinely spending long hours watching the night sky. The specific Egyptian practice of timing the appearance of the star Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, as a calendar event marking the beginning of the Nile flood and the beginning of the agricultural year, reflected both the astronomical knowledge accumulated through years of nighttime observation and the practical importance of the flood to a civilization whose survival depended on it. The Egyptians were watching the night sky carefully because their nighttime lives gave them the opportunity to do so, and their agricultural and theological calendars were built on what they saw. The night watch culture, the individuals who maintained security, fire watch, and water supply through the night hours, was an extension of this nighttime activity. The night was not simply when everyone was asleep. It was when a significant portion of the population was working the cooler hours portion of their day, while the daytime workers rested through the peak heat. The continuous operation of Egyptian civilization across the temperature extremes of the day depended on this division of labor across the temperature cycle. We have established the general strategies by which ordinary Egyptians manage the heat. Now let us talk about the people who push those strategies to their limits. The workers engaged in the most physically demanding labor in the most exposed conditions, whose survival depended on the organizational and practical systems around them functioning correctly. The pyramid builders are the most famous example. The logistics of moving multi-ton stone blocks in a 100-degree desert environment required not just engineering skill, but a comprehensive heat management system for the workforce. We know from the archaeological evidence at the Giza workers' village that the organizational system around pyramid construction addressed heat as a practical constraint rather than leaving workers to manage it individually. The water supply infrastructure at Giza was significant. There were bakeries and breweries producing the bread and beer that were the primary food and hydration for the workforce. There were medical practitioners. We know this from the skeletal evidence of treated injuries and from references to physicians in the administrative records. The workers were provided with shade structures during rest periods. The work schedule followed the split-day pattern that avoided the peak heat hours. None of this fully eliminated heat-related illness and death among the workforce. The physical demands of pyramid construction were extreme under any conditions, and in the Egyptian summer heat, those demands could overwhelm even healthy adults with adequate water supply. The medical text's specific treatments for heat exhaustion reflect the frequency with which the condition was encountered, and the existence of standardized treatments implies a medical system that expected to deal with these cases regularly. The agricultural workers who maintained Egypt's food supply, the farmers who worked the fields along the Nile through the agricultural season, faced a different but equally demanding relationship with the heat. The agricultural calendar was timed to the Nile flood, and the ploughing, planting and harvesting cycles fell at specific times that were not always the most thermally convenient. Harvest, in particular, was intense physical labour that could not wait for cooler conditions. The grain had to come in when it was ready, regardless of the temperature. The farming communities that lined the Nile developed their own heat management systems, adapted to the specific demands of agricultural work. Working hours were adjusted to the split-day pattern where possible. Fields near the river provided access to water for drinking and for the evaporative cooling of dampening clothing. The specific agricultural tools and techniques used were designed for efficiency rather than speed. Slower, more deliberate work in hot conditions reduced the metabolic heat load compared to frantic activity, and experienced farmers knew not to push through the heat at a pace that would cause collapse before the day's work was done. The specific vulnerability of harvest time to heat-related illness is reflected in the Egyptian practice of distributing additional water and food to agricultural workers during intensive periods. The administrative records show that during specific high-demand agricultural periods, the ration distributions were adjusted upward. More beer, more bread, sometimes additional onions and garlic. The practical connection between heavy labour in heat and increased nutritional and hydration needs was understood and addressed administratively. The Nile was not just a water source and a transportation corridor. It was the primary cooling infrastructure of Egyptian civilization, a ribbon of water running through the desert that provided temperature relief to everyone who could access it, and around which the heat management strategies of Egyptian life were ultimately organised. The temperature of the Nile water was significantly lower than the surrounding air temperature during the summer months. The river drew water from sources far to the south, and while that water was warm by northern standards, it was meaningfully cooler than 100-degree desert air temperature. Contact with the river, immersion, wading, or simply being near the water surface, where evaporative cooling was most active, provided genuine temperature relief that was unavailable anywhere else in the Egyptian landscape. Egyptians swam. This is documented in tomb paintings, in textual references, and in the physical layout of settlements that were consistently positioned as close to the river as flood risk permitted. Children swimming in the Nile appears in Egyptian art with a matter-of-fact frequency that reflects the practice as a normal feature of childhood and of hot weather generally. The cooling benefit of immersion in water that was cooler than body temperature, even water that was not particularly cold by modern standards, was immediate and significant, and the Nile provided this benefit to settlements throughout its length. The crocodile problem complicated the swimming calculation considerably. The Nile crocodile, one of the most dangerous animals in Africa, was abundant in the ancient Nile, and immersion in crocodile-inhabited water was not an activity to be undertaken without awareness of the risk. The specific ways in which the Egyptians navigated this tension, which areas of the river were considered safer, which times of day and times of year were more or less dangerous, which activities required river access and which could be rearranged to avoid it, reflected generations of accumulated local knowledge about crocodile behaviour and habitat. The religious management of the crocodile risk through Sobek worship was partly psychological and partly practical. The temples of Sobek at locations throughout Egypt served as centres of local knowledge about crocodile behaviour, maintained by priests whose institutional knowledge included the practical information of where and when crocodiles were most active. Consulting the temple before undertaking activities that required river access had a practical information dimension alongside its theological one. The irrigation system that extended the Nile's water across the agricultural land also extended its cooling influence. The network of irrigation channels that covered the cultivated areas of Egypt created a landscape that was significantly cooler and more humid than the unirrigated desert immediately beyond it. Walking through irrigated fields, the air carried moisture from the evaporation of the irrigation water, not the humidity of a tropical environment, but measurably more moisture than the bare desert air. The microclimatic cooling of the irrigated Nile Valley was one of the factors that made it habitable in a way that the surrounding desert was not. Having examined all the strategies by which the Egyptians managed the heat, let us now address honestly what happened when those strategies failed, because they did fail, with a regularity that the historical record documents with the same matter-of-fact completeness as everything else. Heat death in ancient Egypt was real. The medical texts describe it. The administrative records document work stoppages caused by heat-related illness among workers. The evidence in the skeletal remains of individuals who died in their working years, of causes that left no obvious skeletal trauma, but that the demographic profile suggests were related to the physical stresses of hard labour in extreme heat, speaks to a population that paid a genuine biological cost for living and working in their environment. The most vulnerable populations were the most predictable ones. Children whose heat regulation mechanisms are less mature than adults faced elevated risk during extreme heat events. The elderly, whose cardiovascular systems were less able to respond to the demands of heat stress with increased output, were similarly vulnerable. The sick and the weakened, whose physiological reserves were already depleted, could not sustain the demands of heat management on top of their existing illness. The records of deaths among workers at construction sites during the hottest periods reflect elevated rates among these vulnerable groups. Famine years compounded the heat mortality problem significantly. In years when the Nile flood was insufficient, when the harvest was poor and food supply was constrained, the population entered the heat season with reduced nutritional reserves. A poorly nourished body has less physiological capacity for heat management. The cardiovascular output required to maintain cooling circulation is metabolically expensive. The replacement of sweat losses requires adequate protein for cellular repair, alongside adequate water. In a food-scarce year, the combination of heat stress and nutritional stress was more lethal than either alone. The administrative response to heat emergencies was documented in several surviving records. In extreme heat events, periods when the temperature exceeded even the high normal range for Egyptian summer, work on major construction projects was sometimes suspended entirely. The records of Deir el-Medina show specific occasions when work stopped with heat or heat-related illness recorded as the cause. The decision to stop work was not made lightly. The pharaoh's tomb needed to be built. The schedule was real, and the consequences of delay were significant. That the administrators chose to stop work rather than continue losing workers tells you something about how seriously the heat risk was taken. The medical response to heat-related illness was, by ancient standards, reasonably sound. Rest in shade was the immediate response. Cool water, the coolest available, given the constraints of ceramic vessel storage rather than refrigeration, was provided for drinking and for application to the body. Preparations made from cooling plants were applied to the head and body. The patient was fanned to promote evaporative cooling. All of these are the interventions that modern heat/first aid recommends, arrived at by observation rather than physiology. We have spent this script exploring how the ancient Egyptians managed their brutal thermal environment, and it is worth stepping back now to assess, from the perspective of modern environmental science and physiology, how well their solutions actually worked and which of them represent genuinely impressive achievements. The architecture stands up extraordinarily well to modern analysis. The wind catcher, the thick mud brick wall, the orientation to catch prevailing winds, the thermal mass of construction materials. These are passive cooling techniques that modern architects studying zero-energy building design in hot climates have rediscovered and are actively implementing. Buildings designed according to these principles in the modern Middle East and North Africa can maintain interior temperatures 15 to 20 degrees cooler than outside air without any mechanical cooling. The Egyptian architects who developed these principles over thousands of years of empirical refinement arrived at solutions that modern computer-aided design confirms as optimal. The clothing solution, light white linen, loose fit, maximum skin exposure for evaporative cooling, is exactly what modern sports performance fabric technology is attempting to replicate with synthetic materials. Moisture-wicking athletic fabrics are trying to do what Egyptian linen did naturally. The white or light color principle is confirmed by modern radiative heat analysis. The Egyptians' clothing choices were thermally optimal and remain so. The diet and hydration strategies were largely sound. The emphasis on high water content vegetables, the use of fermented beverages for safer hydration, the timing of meals relative to activity and rest, the salt and electrolyte content of the standard diet. All of these practices addressed real physiological needs in ways that modern nutritional science supports. The specific plants used in Egyptian cooling preparations, some of which have documented properties relevant to heat management, reflect a pharmacological knowledge built through extensive empirical observation. The split-day work schedule with midday rest was correct by any measure of occupational health and human performance in hot climates. The siesta cultures that preserve this pattern in the modern world are maintaining a practice that modern research on human performance consistently validates. Cognitive and physical performance in hot conditions is genuinely better in the morning and evening than at midday peak. The Egyptian schedule was built on observed reality. What the Egyptians could not do was eliminate the fundamental problem that their environment was genuinely at the edge of human habitability. 3,000 years of accumulated wisdom and remarkable ingenuity could not make the Nile Valley easy to live in during the height of summer. They could make it survivable. They could make it the foundation of a civilization that lasted longer than any other. They could build things that are still standing, but they did it at a cost, in physical wear, in heat-related illness and death, in the constant allocation of resources to the management of a climate that never became comfortable. If you thought ordinary Egyptian life in the heat was demanding, spare a thought for the priests. Because the religious obligations of Egyptian priestly life placed specific demands on specific people in specific places at specific times, regardless of what the thermometer was doing, and some of those obligations were conducted in conditions that would make a modern health and safety officer reach for their incident report form. The Egyptian temple was a remarkable piece of architecture that, as we discussed, incorporated genuine passive cooling technology, thick walls, strategic ventilation, the thermal mass of massive stone construction. All of these kept the temple interior meaningfully cooler than the outside air. The inner sanctuary where the god's cult statue resided was typically the deepest, most enclosed, most thermally stable part of the entire complex, and the temperature in these innermost chambers could be genuinely cool by Egyptian standards, even on the hottest summer days. But the priest's duties were not confined to the cool interior. The outdoor ceremonies, the processions, the public rituals conducted in temple courtyards and on processional routes between temples, all of these took place in the full Egyptian sun, conducted by priests in the full formal regalia of their office, which was not designed with thermal comfort as a primary consideration. The formal dress of a senior Egyptian priest included white linen robes. The good thermal properties of white linen helped, but also leopard skin cloaks for specific ritual roles, elaborate headdresses, and in some contexts, full animal masks representing the deity being honoured. a jackal-headed mask representing Anubis, worn by the Sem priest conducting mummification rituals or funerary ceremonies, was a substantial piece of headgear that fitted over the entire head and restricted both ventilation and vision. Wearing such a mask in a summer funeral procession in the Egyptian sun was an exercise in commitment to professional duty over personal comfort. The morning ritual that opened the temple each day required the senior priest to approach the innermost sanctuary, break the clay seal on the sanctuary door, perform specific purification rituals, open the shrine containing the god's cult statue, and conduct the daily awakening, washing, clothing, and feeding of the divine image. This ritual was conducted daily, without exception, in all weathers and all temperatures, because the daily care of the god was not optional. A day on which the god was not properly cared for was a day on which the cosmic order was not properly maintained, and the cosmic order was considered more important than the comfort of the priest responsible for maintaining it. The purification requirements that preceded any direct contact with the divine were also relevant to the heat. Ritual purity required washing, and the washing was done with cold water, or at least the coldest water available, which in an Egyptian summer was not very cold. The psychological bracing of cold water application before ritual performance in a hot climate was presumably both purifying and thermally useful, and it is one of those cases where the religious requirement and the physiological benefit coincided. The festival ceremonies that brought the gods out of their temples and through the city streets created the most extreme heat exposure situations for the priestly participants. The Opet festival, during which the cult statues were carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor, lasted for weeks and involved sustained outdoor activity by large numbers of priests, musicians, and attendants. The timing of this festival in late summer, during the Nile flood period, meant that it occurred during some of the hottest weeks of the Egyptian year. The priests carrying the heavy sacred barks on their shoulders through the streets of Thebes in August were conducting one of the most important religious ceremonies in Egypt, while simultaneously engaged in heavy physical labour in extreme heat. That these festivals continued without apparent disruption through centuries of extremely hot Egyptian summers tells you both about the organizational capacity of the Egyptian religious system and about the heat tolerance that the combination of climate acclimatization, appropriate preparation, and sheer cultural necessity had produced in the population that maintained them. Children are physiologically less equipped to manage heat stress than adults, and in an environment as thermally challenging as ancient Egypt, the survival of children through the critical early years required specific protective strategies beyond those adequate for adults. The Egyptian response to child heat vulnerability is documented in medical texts, in household archaeology, and in the specific cultural practices around childcare that survived in the written record. The infant in ancient Egypt faced the heat challenge from the first days of life. Newborns have extremely limited thermoregulatory capacity. They cannot shiver effectively to generate heat when cold and cannot sweat efficiently to cool when hot. They are essentially dependent on their environment and caregivers for temperature management during the early weeks of life. In an Egyptian summer, the risk was hypothermia rather than cold, and the protective practices around newborns reflected this. The swaddling of Egyptian infants, a practice described in detail in household management and medical texts, served multiple functions. But in the context of heat management, it is interesting because it appears to contradict the logic of minimizing insulation in a hot environment. Swaddling wraps the infant in fabric that restricts air circulation and should, theoretically, increase heat retention. The Egyptian rationalization for swaddling was structural. It was believed to ensure the proper development of straight limbs. But the practice also provided a consistent microenvironment immediately around the infant's body that was less variable than the surrounding air temperature, which in the specific context of a desert environment with extreme day-night temperature variation provided stability that reduced thermal stress, even if it increased the average temperature slightly. The nursing practices of ancient Egypt were aligned with the heat management needs of infants. Breast milk provides both nutrition and hydration, and in a hot climate, the hydration component is particularly critical. Egyptian medical texts recommend extended nursing periods and specifically caution against introducing other foods and liquids too early, a recommendation that modern pediatric medicine has confirmed is appropriate for infant gut health, but that in the Egyptian context also served the heat management function of maintaining adequate hydration through a consistently safe liquid source. The specific positioning of infants relative to shade and air movement was detailed in household practice. Cradles were positioned to catch any available breeze. The coolest part of the house, the north-facing, lowest, most thermally stable space, was where infants spent the hottest parts of the day. The use of fans, palm leaf fans wielded by servants or family members to create air movement around sleeping infants in the hottest conditions is documented in some household texts. Older children's heat exposure was managed through a combination of restricted activity during peak heat hours, access to water for drinking and for cooling through immersion in canals and the river, and the practical shade of the domestic environment. The school schedule, where scribal education was conducted, was apparently organised to avoid the hottest hours, with morning sessions before the peak heat and the midday rest corresponding to the school's own activity break. The games and activities of Egyptian children, as depicted in tomb paintings, are almost exclusively shown in the morning or evening hours. The cooler parts of the day, when outdoor activity was thermally manageable. This may reflect the artistic convention of showing favourable conditions, or it may accurately represent when children's outdoor activity was culturally and practically permitted. Here is the factor in the Egyptian heat survival equation that is perhaps the most important and the most frequently overlooked: acclimatization. The Egyptians were not managing the heat purely through external strategies. Their bodies had adapted to the heat through a biological process that significantly increased their capacity to function in high-temperature environments compared to a person from a temperate climate who was dropped into the same conditions. Human acclimatization to heat is a real and well-documented physiological process. When a person spends sustained time in a hot environment, the body undergoes specific adaptations that increase its heat tolerance. These adaptations begin within a few days of heat exposure and are substantially complete within 2 to 3 weeks. They are temporary. They reverse when the person returns to a cooler environment for an extended period, but while in place they represent a significant biological upgrade to the person's heat management capacity. The specific physiological changes that occur during heat acclimatization include an increase in sweat rate. The acclimatized person starts sweating earlier and sweats more per unit of thermal stress than the non-acclimatized person, producing more evaporative cooling. The composition of sweat changes. The acclimatized person's sweat contains less salt than the non-acclimatized person's sweat, which means they retain more electrolytes for each litre of fluid lost. The cardiovascular system adapts. Blood volume increases, which improves the circulatory system's ability to deliver blood to the skin surface for cooling while maintaining organ perfusion. The core temperature at which sweating begins decreases, meaning the cooling response starts sooner relative to heat exposure. The net effect of full acclimatization is substantial. An acclimatized person can perform physical work in conditions that would cause heat exhaustion in a non-acclimatized person within hours. Their cardiovascular system is less stressed by the demands of heat management. They sweat more efficiently. They can maintain higher levels of physical performance at high temperatures. The Egyptians were fully acclimatized. Every Egyptian who was born and raised in Egypt, which was the vast majority of the Egyptian population, had lived their entire life in the heat and had maintained full acclimatization continuously from infancy. Their bodies were operating with the full suite of heat adaptations that sustained exposure had produced. They were not white-knuckling their way through the heat with coping strategies alone. They were physiologically equipped for it in ways that a person from a temperate climate simply is not. This biological advantage is not visible in the material record of Egyptian civilization. There are no tomb paintings of cardiovascular adaptations, no papyri describing the sweat rate improvements of the acclimatized worker. But it was the foundation on which all the other strategies operated. The linen clothing, the wind catchers, the oil, the beer, the siesta. All of these strategies were being deployed by bodies that were significantly better at managing heat than yours is. The acclimatization advantage helps explain some of the achievements that seem impossible from a modern perspective. How did workers maintain physical labor in the pyramid construction heat for extended periods? They were acclimatized. How did priests carry out strenuous outdoor ceremonies in the full summer heat without apparent collapse? They were acclimatized. How did farmers work through harvest season in 100-degree heat? They were acclimatized. The strategies mattered. The biology mattered more. The strategies that Egypt developed for surviving its brutal thermal environment did not die with the civilization. They spread through trade, through conquest, through the simple geographic persistence of hot climate populations who continued to live in hot places and continued to use what worked. The passive cooling architecture of ancient Egypt is the direct ancestor of the wind tower traditions of the Persian Gulf, the courtyard houses of North Africa and the Levant, the cool interior spaces of traditional Islamic architecture, and ultimately the modern movement toward passive building design in hot climates. The principle that a building should work with its climate rather than simply being mechanically cooled against it is being rediscovered by architects working on sustainable design. And when they study historical precedents for effective passive cooling, they consistently return to Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern models. The linen clothing solution has influenced dress in hot climate regions continuously from antiquity to the present. The specific thermal properties of linen that made it optimal for Egyptian conditions remain valid. Linen breathes, it wicks moisture, it reflects solar radiation when white. The global linen and natural fiber industry that supplies hot climate regions today is the commercial descendant of the Egyptian linen tradition that supplied the Nile Valley with its survival clothing for 3,000 years. The siesta culture that persists across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and parts of Latin America is a direct cultural inheritance from the split-day schedule that hot climate civilizations developed in antiquity. The scientific vindication of the siesta. Modern research consistently shows benefits to cognitive performance and cardiovascular health from the midday rest, represents the intellectual community catching up to something that practical human experience had established millennia earlier. The water management knowledge, the irrigation systems, the canal networks, the water storage technologies that Egypt developed not only for agricultural purposes, but for the thermal management of its population influenced water engineering across the ancient and medieval worlds. The shaduf, the nilometer, the canal systems. These were technologies that spread through contact with Egypt and were adapted in various forms across the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean, and beyond. And perhaps most significantly, the Egyptian experience of living at the edge of human thermal tolerance produced a medical knowledge of heat-related illness and treatment that influenced the ancient medical tradition that Egypt shared with the Greek and Roman world. The Egyptian medical observations about heat, cooling, and the body's responses to thermal stress were part of the accumulated medical knowledge that travelled through the ancient world and contributed to the foundations of Western medicine. Egypt did not just survive the heat, it used the heat as a problem that demanded the kind of sophisticated, multi-generational problem-solving that produces genuine civilization. The thermal challenge produced architectural innovation, agricultural engineering, medical knowledge, cultural practices, and biological adaptation that together made one of the most formidable environments on Earth into the cradle of one of history's greatest civilizations. That is not a small achievement. That is 3,000 years of applied human ingenuity, and it deserves every bit of the respect it has earned. Everything we have discussed so far describes life in the Nile Valley, the inhabited ribbon of green that followed the river and was sustained by it. But ancient Egypt was not just the Nile Valley. The desert beyond the river's floodplain was also Egypt, and people traversed it, worked in it, and sometimes died in it, and the strategies for surviving the open desert were an entirely different category of challenge from the strategies for surviving a hot day in a Nile-side village. The eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea was traversed by mining expeditions, by trading caravans, and by the military forces that used desert routes for strategic movement. The western desert, the Sahara, was crossed by trade routes connecting Egypt to oasis settlements and to the civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa. Both deserts presented thermal challenges of a severity that made the Nile Valley summer look moderate by comparison. In the open desert, shade was architectural. There were no buildings, no trees, no permanent shade structures. The only shade available was what the expedition carried with it: awnings, tents, portable shelters that could be erected during the midday heat and struck when the temperature dropped enough to permit movement. The administrative records of Egyptian desert expeditions specify the equipment carried in terms that include shade provision as a logistical category alongside food, water, and tools. Water in the open desert was the governing constraint around which all expedition planning was organized. The weight of water required to sustain a workforce through a desert crossing of any significant distance was immense, and the logistical challenge of carrying enough water while also carrying the tools, food, and equipment necessary for the expedition's purpose required careful planning. The papyrus records of specific desert expeditions to turquoise mines in the Sinai, to gold mines in the eastern desert, and to quarries in various remote locations show water logistics as a primary planning concern, with specific records of water supply points, water carrier allocations, and the consequences when water supply failed. The consequences of water failure in the open desert were swift and total. An expedition that ran out of water in the Egyptian desert, without being close to a known water source, was in immediate mortal danger. The medical outcome of severe dehydration in a 100-plus-degree desert environment without shade is measurable in hours rather than days. The Egyptian records include accounts of expeditions that suffered serious casualties from heat and water shortage, and the administrative language of these records carries a weight of institutional understanding about exactly what the risks were. The timing of desert expeditions was carefully managed around the thermal calendar. The most demanding desert crossings were scheduled for the cooler months, the Egyptian winter, when daytime temperatures were manageable, and nighttime temperatures provided genuine recovery opportunity. Summer expeditions to the most exposed desert locations were avoided when possible and conducted with maximum logistical support when they could not be avoided. The specific routes used for desert travel were chosen not just for directness but for the location of water sources along the way. The knowledge of desert wells and water sources was carefully maintained institutional knowledge, passed between generations of expedition leaders and recorded in administrative documents. A desert route that could be travelled safely in winter became a potential death trap if a water source was dry or if timing forced travel through the hottest months. The geographic intelligence of Egyptian desert travel was fundamentally organised around water and shade availability rather than simple distance optimization. Within the desert that surrounded the Nile Valley, a series of oases provided islands of relative habitability in an otherwise hostile landscape. The major oases of the Egyptian Western Desert, Karga, Dakhla, Farafra, Baharia, and Siwa, were permanent settlements with their own agricultural production, their own temples and administrative structures, and their own thermal management challenges that differed from both the Nile Valley and the open desert. The oasis provided water from underground aquifers that brought water to the surface through natural springs or through human-dug wells, and the water provided the possibility of vegetation, shade, and the evaporative cooling that made the difference between habitable and not. A well-watered oasis in the Egyptian desert could support a community of thousands, growing date palms, vegetables, and grain, maintaining livestock, and participating in the trade networks that crossed the desert. The thermal management strategies of oasis settlements combined the approaches used in the Nile Valley with specific adaptations to the more extreme desert conditions. The architecture was similar in principle: mud brick construction, thick walls, wind catchers, flat roofs for night sleeping. But the scale of the thermal challenge was greater, since the oasis lacked the moderating effect of the river and was surrounded on all sides by the full heat of the desert rather than bounded by water on one side. The date palm was not just a food source in oasis culture, it was an architectural element of the thermal environment. The tall, dense crown of the mature date palm provides shade at the height where solar radiation is most intense while allowing air circulation beneath, combining the sun-blocking function of a dense canopy with the ventilation that allows evaporative cooling to continue working. An oasis planted with date palms was measurably cooler at ground level than the open desert immediately surrounding it, due to the combination of shade, evapotranspiration from the palm leaves, and the cooling of the ground by the palm's shadow. The specific management of date palms in Egyptian oasis culture reflected this understanding. Palms were planted in patterns that maximized ground shade while maintaining adequate spacing for individual palm health and productivity. The placement of human activity relative to the palm grove was deliberate. The coolest and most comfortable areas for outdoor activity were under and near the palms, and the daily schedule of oasis life was organized around the shade patterns that the palms cast across the settlement through the day. The political and administrative importance of the oases to the Egyptian state was related partly to their strategic position on desert trade routes and partly to their role as support points for desert expeditions. The oasis settlements maintained the water sources, the guides, the emergency food and water supplies that made long-distance desert travel possible for Egyptian state activities. The administrative structures the Egyptian state maintained in the oases were the logistical backbone of everything that happened in the desert between the Nile Valley and the desert frontiers. The animals of ancient Egypt had been solving the heat problem for far longer than the Egyptians had, and the indigenous wildlife of the Nile Valley and the surrounding desert represented millions of years of evolutionary optimization for thermal survival in the Egyptian climate. The Egyptians, as sharp observers of the natural world who interacted closely with its animals, learned from these evolutionary solutions and sometimes incorporated them into their own heat management practices. The camel is the animal most associated with desert survival in popular imagination, but the camel was introduced to Egypt relatively late in its history. The widespread use of camels for desert transport became significant only in the first millennium BCE. Before that, donkeys were the primary pack animal for desert travel, and donkeys are themselves impressively heat-adapted animals, whose endurance in hot conditions exceeds that of most other domestic animals. The ibis, sacred to Thoth, present in enormous numbers along the Nile, was observed by Egyptians to appear most actively in the early morning and evening, resting during the midday heat in the shade of riverbank vegetation. The behavioural pattern of the ibis mirrored the split-day schedule that Egyptian workers followed, and whether the human observation of animal behaviour contributed to the human adoption of the same schedule is impossible to determine, but the parallel is notable. The cobra, whose management was essential to life in Egyptian settlements, had its own heat management behavior. The Egyptian cobra was most active in the early morning and evening, the same cooler hours that Egyptians used for outdoor activity, and retreated to underground refuges during the hottest parts of the day. The practical consequence for Egyptians was that the hours of peak cobra activity coincided with the hours of human activity, making snake awareness a constant companion to the daily routine. The theological elevation of the cobra to divine status, in the form of the uraeus on the royal headdress, was partly a recognition of the animal's intimate and unavoidable presence in Egyptian daily life. The observation that specific desert animals survived in conditions that no water source appeared to support led Egyptian natural historians to theories about water acquisition that were partly correct. The desert fox and the sand cat, both present in the Egyptian desert margins, were understood to obtain water from their prey rather than from standing water sources, an observation that was accurate and that reflected the Egyptian tendency to observe nature carefully and draw practical conclusions from what they saw. The scarab beetle was sacred to the sun god Khepri, and its habit of rolling a ball of dung across the desert was interpreted as a symbol of the sun being rolled across the sky. But the scarab's actual heat management behavior was also observed. The beetle positions itself on the ball of dung, which is cooler than the surrounding sand, and uses this temperature differential to cool itself. The observation of this behavior contributed to the Egyptian understanding that contact with cooler materials provided temperature relief, a principle that was applied in various forms in human heat management strategies. We have covered the physical strategies for heat survival extensively: the architecture, the clothing, the diet, the schedule, the biology. But there is one dimension of heat survival that the physical strategies alone cannot fully account for, and that is the psychological dimension. Because heat is not just a physical stressor, it is a mental one. And the ways in which the Egyptians managed the psychological experience of living in relentless heat tell us something important about how civilization sustains itself in genuinely difficult conditions. Heat impairs cognitive function. This is well established in modern research. Reaction times slow, decision-making quality deteriorates, irritability increases, and the capacity for the kind of sustained focused attention that complex work requires is measurably reduced in hot conditions. The Egyptian state, which depended on the cognitive function of scribes, administrators, priests, and craftsmen to manage one of the most complex civilizations in the ancient world, was therefore a cognitive enterprise running in conditions that challenged cognitive performance daily. The Egyptian solution to this challenge was not purely physical, it was also cultural and psychological, a set of shared beliefs, practices, and social structures that manage the psychological experience of heat in ways that maintain the cognitive and emotional stability of the population. The religious framework was central to this. The Egyptian understanding that the heat was the presence and power of Ra, that the sun's ferocity was not a hostile environmental force but the expression of divine energy that sustained all life, transformed the psychological experience of heat exposure. You are not suffering under a hostile sun. You were in the presence of the most powerful deity in the Egyptian pantheon, whose energy was the foundation of existence itself. This reframing did not make the heat cooler, but it changed the emotional relationship to the experience from helpless suffering to participation in the cosmic order. The specific ritual acknowledgement of the sun each morning, the prayer to Ra at dawn that was standard Egyptian practice, was both a religious observance and a psychological preparation for the day. Beginning each day by consciously acknowledging the sun's power and your place within the cosmic order, it represented was a cognitive orienting practice. You knew what you were dealing with, you had named it, you had acknowledged its authority. And having done that, you could go about your day with a framework for understanding your experience that reduced the psychological toll of it. The festival culture we discussed served a psychological function alongside its religious and social ones. The great festivals that punctuated the Egyptian year provided emotional release, communal celebration, and the specific psychological benefit of transcendence, of stepping outside the ordinary daily grind and participating in something larger and more joyful. The distribution of food and drink at festivals was economically significant, but the psychological value of the collective joy, the music and dancing and communal feasting, the temporary suspension of the daily discipline that heat survival required, was equally real. The humour that runs through Egyptian daily life, the satirical papyri, the workers' graffiti, the names of work gangs, the records of absence, with their understated explanations, was also a psychological heat management tool. Humour is a documented stress management mechanism that reduces the psychological burden of difficult conditions by creating cognitive distance from them. The Egyptian worker who named his gang the Drunkards of Menkaure was doing something psychologically healthy in conditions that demanded psychological resilience. The love poetry of Deir el-Medina, some of the most beautiful emotional writing of the ancient world, was produced by people living and working in extreme conditions, and its existence is itself a testimony to the psychological health of the community that produced it. You do not write love poetry when your mind is consumed by survival anxiety. You write love poetry when you have enough psychological space to notice beauty, to feel longing, to invest in emotional experience beyond the immediate physical demands of your environment. The love poetry tells us that the heat management strategies worked well enough to leave room for the full range of human emotional experience. As climate change drives temperatures higher across the globe, the question of how human civilization manages extreme heat is becoming increasingly urgent and increasingly practical. And in this context, the ancient Egyptian solutions, which are developed under conditions of sustained extreme heat that some currently temperate regions are beginning to experience, are being studied with a seriousness and a respect that purely antiquarian interest would not generate. The passive cooling architecture of ancient Egypt is the subject of active research programs at universities and architectural firms working on sustainable design for hot climates. The specific principles of thermal mass, natural ventilation, wind capture, and strategic orientation that Egyptian builders developed empirically are being formalized in modern building codes and design guidelines for hot climate construction. The Egyptian mud brick house that kept its interior 15 degrees cooler than the outside air without any mechanical system is the model for zero-energy cooling architecture in the 21st century. The clothing solutions are being studied by performance materials researchers trying to develop fabrics that replicate the thermal properties of fine linen using synthetic materials that are more durable and more consistent. The specific properties that made Egyptian linen optimal, moisture wicking, rapid drying, solar reflectivity when white, breathability, are the target specification for modern, hot climate performance clothing. The Egyptians met that specification with a plant fibre processed by hand. Modern textile engineers are still working on matching it with petrochemical-derived synthetics. The urban planning implications of the Egyptian approach to heat are being examined by city planners dealing with the urban heat island effect, the phenomenon by which urban areas are measurably hotter than surrounding rural areas because of the heat-absorbing properties of modern building materials and the waste heat of mechanical cooling systems. The Egyptian principle that building orientation, material selection, and the strategic placement of water features and vegetation can significantly reduce ambient urban temperatures without mechanical intervention is exactly what urban planners trying to reduce the urban heat island need to hear. The dietary and hydration strategies of hot climate human populations are informing modern occupational health guidelines for workers in hot conditions. The specific combination of hydration management, electrolyte replacement, timing of meals relative to activity, and the specific plants used in cooling preparations are all areas where traditional practice from hot climate civilizations is providing research directions for modern sports medicine and occupational health. The acclimatization research that documents how the human body adapts to heat is being used to develop protocols for helping workers from temperate climates function safely in hot climate conditions. The military, construction workers in the Middle East and Gulf states, agricultural workers during heat waves. The Egyptian population was fully acclimatized by default. Modern populations from temperate climates deploying to hot environments need managed acclimatization programs, and the research that defines those programs is built on understanding exactly the physiological adaptations that made the Egyptians so much better at surviving their climate than you would be. And finally, the psychological and social dimensions of Egyptian heat management are informing approaches to community resilience in the face of climate stress. The Egyptian festival culture, the shared religious framework for understanding environmental challenge, the humour and poetry and social connection that maintain psychological health in difficult conditions, all of these have modern equivalents in the community resilience research that studies how populations survive and function under sustained environmental stress. Egypt solves the heat problem well enough to build a 3,000-year civilization in the middle of a desert. The modern world, facing the prospect of temperatures rising across regions that have never had to develop Egyptian-level heat management strategies, has a lot to learn from how they did it. And there you have it. 100-degree desert survived, mostly, through ingenuity, observation, and 3,000 years of figuring out what worked. You would not have managed. Let us be completely honest about this. You, with your air conditioning and your refrigerated water and your SPF 50 and your electrolyte drinks and your synthetic moisture-wicking fabrics, stripped of all of that and dropped into the Egyptian summer at its peak, you would be in serious trouble within a day. Not because you're weak, but because your entire existence has been organized around the assumption of climate control that the Egyptians simply never had. What they had instead was something arguably more impressive: the accumulated practical knowledge of a civilization that had been solving this specific problem for 3,000 years. Every building was optimized, every garment was designed, every schedule was arranged around the temperature curve. Every meal, every drink, every rest period, every activity placement was part of a comprehensive system for staying alive and functional in an environment that was trying to cook you. They built the largest stone structures in human history in that heat. They wrote the world's oldest medical literature in that heat. They developed the world's first bureaucracy and standardized weights and measures, and the 365-day calendar, and the pin tumbler lock, and bread and beer and love poetry of remarkable beauty. They did all of it in a 100-degree desert, and they did it for 3,000 years. The next time you complain that your office is a bit warm and someone turned the thermostat up, I want you to think about Mera the harbour official, sitting on a boat in the blazing sun in 2560 BCE, filling out his shipping paperwork for the pyramid stones, absolutely drenched in castor oil, and wearing a wig at a formal occasion that he definitely removed later to sleep on his roof under the stars. He managed. You are welcome to try. Thank you for spending tonight in the heat with me. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't already, drop a comment telling me what time it is, where in the world you're watching from, and if you would survive the goose fat shield. Good night. And please go drink a glass of crisp, cold, beautifully filtered, modern water. You have no idea how lucky you are